Work has changed faster than our emotional operating systems. We're more connected than ever, more productive than ever. And yet, burnt out, disengagement, and quiet resentment seem to be rising. Today's guest argues that the missing ingredient isn't efficiency or strategy, it's empathy. Mimi Nicklin is the founder of Empathy Everywhere and the best-selling author of Empathy at Work. She spent years exploring what happens to organizations and individuals when listening becomes a leadership skill rather than a personality trait. Mimi, thank you so much for joining me.
You are so welcome. Thank you for having me in your studio today.
You're welcome. Right, let's jump straight in. So, when did you first realize that something fundamental was missing in the way that we work?
Oh gosh, Lewis. Back in 2018. I mean, perhaps I knew before that. But in 2018, I had moved to Dubai at the time, and I had taken over an agency, an advertising agency, as a CEO for that region. And I moved across the world. And when I got there to that business, I found out that it was, let's say, nearly bankrupt, right? It was a very unstable business, but nobody told me that before I got there. And safe to say, I was very overwhelmed at the time. I quite frankly had no idea what I was doing. I had come from very big corporate organizations. And suddenly I was thrown into this kind of startup environment. And I didn't have, or I felt like I didn't have the skills to turn that around. And I went to see a business coach at the time, and she was asking me about my leadership style. And I remember really clearly I was talking about intuition, being an intuitive leader, which is what I thought I was at the time. And she asked me a question which changed my life, because she said to me, Mimi, is it intuition or is it empathy? And at the time, Lewis, I was like, no, why would it be empathy? What has empathy got to do with the workplace? But to answer your question, I then left that session and started to research empathy in organizations and leadership in our world, and discovered something called the empathy deficit, which is fundamentally the lack of human connection in our world. And once I discovered that, well, then I realized that the gaps were everywhere, and everything changed from then.
Right. So many things to kind of come off the back of this. You talked about empathy, but you also talked about connection. I mean, we're arguably more connected than ever in our world through technology. So, what role has technology and obviously the pandemic and working from home, how has this sort of impacted this situation?
Mhm. Look, I mean, in many ways, but the connectivity issue, the kind of connectivity crisis that we have around us, can't be sort of mapped back to the pandemic, or even to us, moving to working from home. Those things may have impacted, and have in many people's realities, impacted how connected they are to their communities, to their workplaces. But the disconnection reality from a human point of view has been brewing for far longer than that. So the empathy deficit, which is our lack of ability to understand each other, has been increasing for over 30 years. And in that time, we have lost 48% of our empathy, of our ability to
Wow.
use this skill set. Empathy is a skill set to understand each other. So that has to do, like you mentioned, technology. It can be technology, it can be urbanization, relocation, cultural integration. Many, many things impact our ability to connect or disconnect with other people, but it has been growing for a very long time.
So I would maybe have kind of thought before talking to you that sort of the opposite was true. And, fair enough, I wasn't around in the 80s or the 70s. But when I look at films of like, bring me results or get out, you're fired, that kind of stuff. Whereas now it feels that companies do have a duty of care to your mental health. And maybe I was talking from a privileged position
Mm.
because I work for a company that really does take well-being quite seriously and has a well-being lead. Um, but is there a difference between, we've sort of got these policies now in many workplaces, and is there a disconnect between but actually meaning it?
Mm. I think in many organizations, and I hope, Lewis, that yours is one of the wonderful ones. But yes, first of all, I wouldn't think that is consistent. I mean, not even I wouldn't think, I know it's not, because I work with people every day who tell me their realities. So there are still many, I would say, by far the larger percentage of organizations, when you look at the the world who don't have a well-being lead and who aren't taking well-being seriously. So I think your organization is probably in the minority. And sometimes in countries like the UK, which are very developed in these systems, you can feel like the whole world is doing that. But actually, when you step out of the bubble of the island that you guys are on, and that's with the greatest respect, right? But it's an island
Mm,
nation. When
yeah.
you look beyond that, at the other cultures and organizations around the world, it's often not that same picture. So yes, you're right. In many ways, the conversation is rising, and that's why I get to meet people like you, right, Lewis? I don't know how you found me, but probably on LinkedIn, and probably because the conversation is rising, right? People are interested in empathy in the workplace, in connection and belonging and psychological safety in ways that they didn't used to be. So the conversation is rising, but is the change? I don't think so.
Okay,
Not yet.
interesting. Let me put it to you this way then. Why does empathy feel radical in environments that are built around performance at the end of the day? I mean, because I guess the flip of this could be, it doesn't matter how you feel. This is a job. It's not a daycare. Get it done.
Mm. I think the very simple answer, Lewis, is that people don't know what it is. So the people that think this is radical are probably misinterpreting what empathy is.
Mm,
And you touched on that even in your question there, because you spoke about, I don't care how you feel. But the reality is, empathy is a human skill set in understanding and very often has nothing to do with feelings. It may, right? If I'm your good friend, Lewis, I might meet you tonight in a restaurant and say, Lewis, you look really tired tonight, right? Because you are my friend and I'm empathizing with how I perceive you to be. But more often than not, when we talk about empathy in the workplace, we're talking about human insight. I often say to people, how do you expect to motivate your staff if you don't know what motivates them, right? How do you expect to create well-being if you don't know what well-being means to the people you lead? Because, of course, for example, something like well-being, if you are a factory worker in central Mumbai, your definition of well-being is going to be very different from an office worker in central New York, right? So empathy is not an emotion and it's not about being nice. It's not about engaging with your emotions. Empathy is a skill set. It is the ability to take the perspective of those that are around you or with you in that meeting or environment. And it is a hard skill set, Lewis. So people often talk about these as soft skills. I think
yeah.
the day is nearly done of that term. But these are not soft things, right? You're going to find empathy in war zones. You're going to find empathy used in hostage negotiations, in really tough, hard environments when you need to change human behavior. The only way to sustainably change human behavior is to start with understanding. And that's what empathy is. So when you ask the question, why does it feel radical? The answer is because you're misdefining what empathy is in the first place.
Where did this misdefining come from then? Because I got to say, I kind of did think of empathy as a little bit as, it's a feeling and it's showing that you care, but actually you're coming at it from a completely different situation. So where has this kind of misunderstanding about what empathy means and what it looks like in practice come from?
I think, do you know what, Lewis? I think you're the first person to ask me that. So that is, given the amount of work I do in the media, that is amazing to have a new question. But I think probably in its lack of use, certainly in the corporate world, right? So because we haven't been teaching, we haven't been training, we haven't been talking about this forever, basically, or maybe even ever. There is a lot of people who attribute the word empathy to sympathy, to kindness, to compassion, right? So let's clear it. Let's clear it up for all of your listeners, okay? So empathy is a skill set and it's about understanding. Sympathy is an emotion, right? It's the same as pity. I feel sorry for you. It's an emotion. Compassion is an action. I am acting compassionately. I'm donating to the poor or I'm helping someone who needs something. And kindness is a choice. So they're very different things. But when people have no reason to learn, it's very easy to not define these things. So empathy hasn't been a currency in the workplace or in political leadership, for example, of nations for a long time, which is why people like me get to do the work that I do as an empathy advocate, to travel the world every week and help more people just like you say, this is not about being nice. Please be nice to me. That's not what we're talking about, right? We're talking about a skill set in human understanding.
How do you find it traveling the world making the case for this? Are business leaders receptive to it? Do you have to make it in a bit of a different argument, as this is about driving performance of your staff? How do those conversations usually go?
Look, I think on the whole, things are changing very fast, and the receptibility, is that a word? I think I might have made that up.
I
The
know what you mean.
reception of information from other people, you knew what I mean, right? Is changing. So leaders are more and more open to this conversation, which is again why I get to do the work and meet people like you. There is now far more understanding about what empathy is and how that's changing. That has changed insurmountably quickly, Lewis. So if I look at just 3 years ago, I would really have to push my way into these conversations. Now, especially in the last like 3 months, like the very end of 25, the early months of 2026, the conversation is rising so fast that I can barely keep up with the conversation. It's not always pro, right? Not everybody is pro empathy. Some people might be against empathy or the concept of empathy, but either way, the conversation is rising. And once the conversation rises, you know something is changing. If people are talking about it, there is interest, there is openness to the conversation. So it's changing. I would say different countries have different levels of openness. I
Mm.
work predominantly in the East, so most of my time is in Southeast Asia and the Gulf. These markets are very sophisticated in their thinking around these areas. I think lots of the Western markets are also sort of catching up to that as well. So different markets have different levels, but overall, there's far more interest now than there ever has been.
It's interesting. I mean, obviously, you work in different markets to where I'm based, and obviously being in the UK and being sort of closely linked to, I guess, the American culture and what's going on there. Um,
Mhm.
One of the things that I've noticed, and maybe this is UK specific, but because of the cost of living
Mm.
crisis and sort of sky high taxes, there are a certain amount of people that are now feeling like, well, work doesn't pay, or pay enough that it makes it worth it. You know, I think of like maybe back in the day in the 90s, people work themselves into an oblivion, but you know, they get a pool at the end of it. Whereas now they work themselves into an oblivion, they might not even be able to afford their groceries. Um, so obviously you're coming at it from talking about empathy and helping people understand, but there's still going to be a limited amount of things a business leader can do if the going rate for what you do is what you're being paid. So what I'm trying to get at is, you know, fundamentally, if pay is the problem, how do you work with that?
Mm. I think there's a couple of ways to answer that, Lewis. I think, again, firstly, the ability to empathize with your staff is not to please them. Is not, I mean, hopefully you can please them, right? As a leader, it's good to have a team that is motivated and feels like you are fighting for what they need and want. But the actual ability to be an empathetic leader is to understand your workforce. So when I follow the story you just said just then, I think that the way an empathetic leader in that scenario would respond is to recognize the fact I am already paying my team the going rate, right? They are paid well for the jobs they are doing in the market and they are struggling. Why, right? What else can I do that is not of monetary value to be able to support my team, to drive them in engagement, motivation, just joy in life, you know? And in my experience, Lewis, and if you want, I can tell a story or two, but there's many examples where leaders have been able to significantly shift mindsets and how people turn up and the energy in a team without spending any money.
Well,
So
yeah,
the
tell me a
first thing I would say
story.
is that empathy is, well, I'll tell you one. Okay. I'll
Yeah.
tell you the very short version, but I was working in India recently with a software company and they're in Mumbai, and it was a very male, very young workforce in software development. And the CEO called me and he met me through a friend and he said, "Listen, Mimi, I have so many resignations and I keep paying them more, even though it's over the market rate, and they still keep resigning. What do I do about this?" And the first thing I said was, "Well, Sanjay, have you asked them why they're leaving?" And he said, "Oh no." I said, "Okay, well, let's start there, right? Let's start with having a conversation, empathy, right? Insight, understand from the people that are still there, why do you think all your colleagues are leaving? What is the challenge in our workplace where people don't want to stay?" So that's where he started, and he did do that. And then a couple of months later, he called me back and he said, "Mimi, great news, right? We have stopped the resignations." I said, "Well, Sanjay, that's excellent. Tell me what happened." And he said, "Well, I changed the coffee machine." I said,
Oh.
"Okay, Sanjay, you're going to have to tell me a little bit more. than the coffee machine, right? And fundamentally, I mean, I said a little in jest because, of course, there were slightly more changes than this. But one of the things that he found out from his team of young men in India was that they really wanted to, from a status point of view, to drink coffee, takeaway coffee on the way to work every day. And I'm sure just the same in the UK, if you actually add up your coffee bill every month, if you get takeaway coffee every day, it adds up. When you're on entry level salaries, these young men, they didn't really have the disposable income to buy, disposable sort of coffee every morning on the way to work. It just adds up very quickly. But the coffee machine in their office was a very old fashioned kind of, press the button, like Nescafe type machine. Nobody wants to drink that, right? So these young men mentioned that in their conversation with Sanjay. And so he bought them an espresso machine. He bought them, which again in India has probably a little more status than it does in the UK, but a very beautiful coffee machine, fresh milk. He made branded cups that are very nice, sort of solid cardboard cups with their branding. And now these young men could come into the office in the morning and hold a really good cup of coffee. And it's amazing how much that changed engagement, not because of the coffee, but because their boss listened to them, right? So they suddenly feel, our boss, he gets us, right? That drive our motivations. There's many of those types of stories, Lewis, right? Driving human engagement, we think it's all about money, but in Gen Z, money comes 3 out of 5 in their drivers. So
Oh.
there's many things that they care about more than money, So back to your question, can you use empathy in that environment? Absolutely, because what we're talking about is insight. It's like doing research. Understand your customers, understand your employees. How else can you be driving belonging, connection, engagement that doesn't, and in your version, can't rely on a pay rise?
Should you approach this conversation with your staff? Because I can imagine there would be some bosses that are like, well, I don't want them to start pointing out all the cracks because then I'll have to fix them. Or there's, I guess, that kind of psychology thing. If you keep asking people, are you happy? Are you happy? They start thinking, well, maybe I'm not happy. Also, probably some employees may not feel comfortable saying this is what is a driver for me, and this is what I think is a problem. So, from both the employee and the employer side, how do you facilitate these kind of conversations?
Like, I think the first thing, Lewis, and I think I mentioned it earlier, is this term psychological safety, which, most people are relatively aware of now, which fundamentally means, do you feel that you can speak up in the workplace? If you're in an organization that has very low psychological safety, which means, as you were touching on there, that the employees don't feel that they can say they would like a better coffee machine, right? You have bigger problems than your salaries. And
Mm,
probably that's where you should start, right? If your employees don't feel able to mention where the challenges are in the workplace, and I'm not saying calling out big dramatic things, but just, things that could make work better. If they don't feel able to have that conversation with their leaders or with HR or with each other, I think there's cultural issues to focus on. So that would be the first thing that I would say. If you do have quite high psychological safety, but perhaps just a very shy team or lots of introverts in your team that don't really want to speak up, or perhaps you have a very remote team who don't feel able to have those conversations on a screen, perhaps. There's various ways, things like questionnaires, things like feedback forms, things like open forums, things like town halls that the CEO might have every month, and people can submit questions which he or she promises to answer. Obviously he's going to choose the ones, but he answers for the staff. So there are many ways to create more empathetic communication channels which suit different types of people in the workplace, people who have different levels of language and confidence and all of those types of things. As a leader, I don't think you have any excuse. You are a leader. Your job is to lead. You have to have conversations with people. That's why they pay you to be a leader, right? So, in the end, to lead others is to listen. This is what I call listening led leadership. Because in life, Lewis, people follow those who listen to them, right? I'm not going to listen to your advice if you haven't listened to me. So
mm,
if we go back to the restaurant that I mentioned earlier, you and I are going to our restaurant on Friday night, and you're trying to give me advice on my new job, but you haven't given me the chance to tell you anything about my new job. Well, I'm not going to listen to you. You don't know, Lewis, why am I going to listen to your advice? I haven't even told you about my new boss yet, right?
yeah.
We listen to those who listen to us. So if you want your staff to listen to you, to follow you, if you want to have impact and influence and be a people's leader, you have no choice but to start with listening, because that is what leaders do. So from a leadership point of view, you have to find ways to practice. Perhaps you might need some training. Perhaps you might want a coach to help you with that. Perhaps you might want to go on a course. Perhaps you might want to practice. There are many ways to do that. But the first piece has to be intention. You have to intentionally want to listen to others in order to act on that.
Any work environments where this is harder to do than others, or do you just think it's a universal skill? If there is a leader and employees, it should be easy to do, or are there certain jobs or industries where actually this is a bit trickier?
I think there are environments where this is harder to do. I think environments where physically it's very challenging, this is harder, right? In factories, in fields, around large machinery, on railroads, stuff like that, right? Where it's very hard to create the space to really listen to people in a very physical role. I think there's a very tangible reason why it's harder to listen. I think in very remote teams or hybrid teams, it can be difficult. It's not impossible, right? I see many organizations that do it very well. But again, you have to intentionally practice it and you have to intentionally create opportunity to do it. But if you have teams, in even my own team is in 5 countries, if I want to listen to them, I have to really intentionally say, Lewis, let's have a chat at 9 o'clock. I want to hear about your week or your day and make space to listen, right? I have to diarize that because you're not in the room with me. So I think hybrid teams can challenge. I think cross-cultural teams can make it harder because the greatest enemy to understanding is assumption. And when I don't understand your culture, it is easy to make assumptions, right? If I don't ask, I won't know, right? That is the backbone of empathy. The backbone of empathy is curiosity. I have to want to understand your environment, your culture, to be able to engage with you and to listen to you. That could be from language to linguistics, the things I say. Things like high context and low context cultures. In many cultures, they might only say 50% of what they mean. So, and in other cultures, like perhaps more in the UK, people are very open. They tell you everything as it is. So, yeah, I think, Lewis, there are definitely environments where it can be more challenging. And I am British, by the way, just just to give you context. I am from the UK, so I can say that I do know the Brits. Um, but yes, there are environments where listening can be more or less accessible. But as leaders, we can create that intention wherever we are.
Do you think that how do I articulate this one? Do you think that this is sort of against the perception of what people think they are? Because people don't just become CEOs or leaders overnight. You sort of have to demonstrate over years and through promotions that you can lead.
Yeah.
And as you talked there about listening, and I kind of thought of myself, then, like, am I listening? Or am I, or have I in my head just kind of, as I've gone on, I've been promoted and promoted, been like, well, you're there to lead, you're there to tell people, and they're trusting you to navigate the ship. So if you don't know what you're doing, it's going to be frightening for them. But actually balancing that with making sure that I'm listening at the same time is maybe something that, even just as we're talking, is something I need to give more credence to. So do you think that this needs to be more in people's perceptions as they progress? And how do they balance that with, but if you don't show that you're a leader, and if you don't show that you know what you're doing and that you can drive the ship, you're not going to advance?
Mm. I think you've hit the nail on the head in so many ways there. I think there is very low awareness of this. And often, Lewis, when I do masterclasses and we have the tea break, really often, maybe in all of them actually, someone will come to me, normally a man, but only because there tend to be more men in leadership than women. So normally a man. And he will come to me at the tea break and he will say, Mimi, thank you for the workshop. I have to tell you something. And I say, sure, what's up? And he will say, I just realized I haven't been listening to anyone for 35 years. And I say, don't worry, you're not alone. Right? So um, there is very low awareness of this because, as you said, there is this perception that my job is to lead. I must speak more than I listen. I must show power and I must show decisiveness. And of course, as leaders, we must make decisions, right? We must lead our teams. We must help them and support them. But that mindset generally is coming from another era of leadership. And today, most people respond much better to leaders who listen. That does not mean I don't make a decision. I'm going to listen to all of you. And then I'm going to use my experience and all of those promotions, all of that experience to say, okay, I've heard you all. Thank you. I think we should do option A, right? Because I understand the environment. I understand what you've all said. And I think this is the right decision. And I am the leader. And let's hope I'm right. Okay. Um, but I think often, I would say to people who are very much stuck in that kind of old command and control approach to leadership, which is a little bit what you're talking about, right? I'm the boss. I speak. I say, you follow. If you think about being a parent, and if I ask my audiences, do you bring up your children in the exact same way that your parents brought you up, especially in Asia, but all over the world? The audience goes, oh gosh, no, right, no way. So then I ask them, okay, so why do you want to lead in the exact same way that you were led 20 years ago when you were entry level in the workforce? And then they will go, oh, yeah, that makes sense, right? Why is it in our personal lives we've evolved? We say things should change. We bring up our children differently. We understand the world has changed. And yet in the workplace, we constantly say, oh, but when I started, I did this and
Mm.
I did that. And guys, you started 20 years ago. So I think it's changing, Lewis. We have to be open to the environment we're in, open to the world that we're leading in, and open to all of those new generations as well.
So, just on the flip of this, I guess, how do you then navigate saying no? So, to use your analogy of the children thing, if I see that there's something going on with my child, and I sit down with them, and they open up and they say, "Daddy, what the problem is that I really want ice cream for breakfast." I still have to say no. So how do you deal with that when you've sort of asked someone to, I guess, be vulnerable? Maybe sometimes not vulnerable; they're just telling you factually what it is, but it's not within your power to give, or actually you think that is a bad idea as a business leader. That actually we shouldn't open up a branch where we sell hot air balloons or whatever it is. How do you, deal with that?
So if we start with the ice cream example, Lewis, you know what I'll use that, right? I'll use that as an example because I think that if your child, I don't know your child, if my child,
They would eat,
she
they would
probably
eat
would.
ice cream for breakfast every day if I let them.
Yeah, okay. Yeah,
That's that.
mine would too. But if she said that, to me, right? I trust my daughter. She's 8 and she doesn't normally have ice cream for breakfast. So if she came to me and said, Mummy, I really need to talk to you. And I say, okay, tell me what's wrong. She says, well, I really need ice cream for breakfast. Instead of saying, well, you can't have ice cream. And she would say, well, why? I'd say, well, because it's breakfast time. Okay, well, why can't I have ice cream? Well, we don't eat ice cream for breakfast. Well, why? Okay, well, now I'm going to have to really think about why don't we? Why don't we eat ice cream for breakfast? Because we eat yogurt. Yogurt's basically ice cream that's not frozen, right? My point is that often we come into these conversations thinking we have to say no because we should say no. I'm making up the ice cream reality, right? It would be the same in the workplace. I would go into those conversations with the intention to listen first, the intention to understand why is it that this person is asking for ice cream for breakfast. In my daughter's case, she definitely has a reason. Even if in the end I said to her, listen, babe, I think we can probably solve your ice cream desire with yogurt because yogurt's actually really healthy, very similar, just a little bit less cold. Do you think that might solve the problem? Maybe, maybe not. I could convince her. But the point is that I go into that conversation with the intention to listen first before judging, before assuming, before responding. Why is she asking for this? Maybe she has a sore throat. Maybe she's worked out in her little 8-year-old brain that something cold would help her, right? Maybe she's very tired and she knows when she has ice cream, she feels more energetic and she has to go to school. I'm making it up. But if you go into conversations with that open-mindedness and the intention to listen first and to understand, you will find not only do you learn as a parent, as a boss, as a leader, right? But their response is different. Because again, back to what we were saying earlier, people listen when you listen to them. So by the time I've listened to my daughter and I've understood her, and I then say to her, do you know what? I have a better idea. I know you'd like ice cream, but how about we have yogurt and I put a couple of chocolate sprinkles on? It's going to give you that same sweet thing. She's going to go, oh, it's a good idea, right? Because I listened to her. right? She feels, okay, mummy listened, she understood. Okay, she gave me an alternative. It's not exactly what I wanted, but she understood me. It's the same in the workplace. Often I can't give you what you want. You want a promotion. Global team in New York says no promotions this year. I cannot give you that. But if I listen to you and you say, listen, I really need more money. And I say, okay, this is a challenge because we have a pay freeze. But tell me what it is about this increase in salary that would help you. And if you said to me, well, I really want to do my MBA, right? I really want to do an MBA this year. Maybe that's a problem I can solve. Well, actually,
Mm.
whilst we have a pay freeze, we do have an educational grant or we have an internal leadership program. Perhaps I could put you on that, whatever, right? So there are no environments where listening first won't help you. Maybe you'll still say no to the ice cream, but maybe you'll find another way in.
I love that. Just as we wrap up, I want to ask you about the future of empathy in the workplace. I'm going to give you a broad question so you can take it wherever you want. Um, but are we in a
Okay.
transitional phase, as we kind of talked about at the top of this? People don't even really know what empathy is. And will this sort of become the new normal?
Mm.
Is there a worry that AI gets involved and CEOs just say, oh, well, we've got an AI that's in charge of it. It asks them questions every 2 months to see how they're happy, and I get a full report and I just action things I want to do from that.
You're right. It is a big question. I think let's take the AI piece for a moment. I think that the shift in AI is definitely elevating the need for us to have these skills. And that is why, when I mentioned earlier how quickly this conversation is changing, really in 3 years, but actually in 3 months, is because of AI. Because people are realizing that the real competitive edge of our times going forward will be our humanity, right? Because the more AI fixes our processes and does the admin and shifts our operations, what we have left as competitive advantage is how we engage, how we build trust, how we convince, how we persuade, how we negotiate with each other as teams and as leaders. So the AI reality has shifted how important these skills are and will become with children as well. Right? We are rushing as governments all over the world to teach children AI. What about their social emotional skills, right? It's not going to help us very much if we have generations of children that can code bots, but also want to marry them, right? We have some challenges in that, right? So I think the future of empathy sits in a conversation that is elevating around what it is and why we need it. It does, as you say, Lewis, start with definition. I talk about 3 phases: awareness, intention, and accountability. Awareness is exactly what you and I are doing today, making sure that more people are aware of what this is. Intention is some of the other things we've touched on: the intention to be a more listening led leader, to teach your people, to do masterclasses or courses or create content that helps them understand why it's important to be human, why we need to listen to each other. And that is based, most of my work, Lewis, is based in neuroscience. So it's there's no debate, right? It just is how the human brain works. And the third part is in accountability, whether that's in your personal life as a dad or it's as a leader in the workplace, to be accountable either to yourself or your organization to say, we will listen to each other more, because there are no relationships in life that do not improve when we listen first to each other, to context, to our relationship. So I think the future is very bright. It is rising very fast from a government level, social, policy, economic. And the reality is this has a direct impact on our GDP growth, on how much we're able to grow our economies. So the time is now, Lewis, and here's hoping for many more conversations ahead.
And are you hopeful? Do you think we'll do it?
Yes, I'm hopeful that we as humans can do it. I'm incredibly optimistic in the work that I get to do, the very small part that I get to play in it. The only reason I had a slight pause is I think the journey is bumpy. I think we have a lot of things that we have to overcome and go around in order to persuade enough leaders at the top of our shared and mutual humanity and how important that is. And as I said, from a neuroscience point of view, from an economic policy point of view, from children of the future point of view, so I'm very optimistic. I'm just not sure that enough of us are. It's very doom and gloom out there. And that's not going to help us make things better. So I think mindset is a really big part of the equation. And hopefully we can all be more optimistic together.
Love that. Mimi, thank you so much for joining us today. If people would like to find out more about you, speak to you, book you, where should they go?
Thank you. They can find me at www.empathyeverywhere.co, or they can Google my name, Mimi Nicklin, pretty much anywhere. And I do send every 2 weeks a letter to over 10,000 people, which is a very candid pen pal letter. Do you remember pen pals, Lewis? Right? Or are you
Yeah,
too
I
young?
remember the concept. I never had one.
I never had one either. But anyway, these letters are a bit like that. They're very candid letters. It's not a newsletter. It is as close to a handwritten letter as you can get in a digital world. We've had over 10,000 people join us in the last 7 months, and they are at empathyletters.com. So they can pop over and join the letter writing over there.
Thank you so much.
Subscribe for more content.